Welcome back, everybody. It's just turned 11:15 a.m. in sunny Southern California. Delighted to have so many of you still with us. We move to the closing session of the conference on reading and rereading Hilary Mantel. Just to reiterate my comment of earlier that unfortunately Jeanette Carpenter is unable to join us, so there'll be just two papers in this panel on true stories, Mantel and nonfiction, which will be moderated for us by Eileen Pollard. Welcome back, Eileen.
Hi, thanks, Steve. So yes, just two papers in this panel. So I will briefly introduce both panelists and then we will start. So our first panelist is Mashada Manchada, who is based at the Ahmedabad University in Delhi, and she will be presenting on past, present and absent memory and chronotype in Hilary Mantel's Giving Up the Ghost. And then we will have our second panelist, Neil Vickers, based at King's College London, who will be talking to us about Hilary Mantel and psychiatry. So whenever you're ready, Mokshada, if you'd like to start.
What I'm going to talk about is a lot of parallels in fiction, we'll see. I'm largely looking at structure and, the form of how she writes her autobiography, which is Giving Up the Ghost. And a lot of themes that have already been brought up in all the papers that we've heard so far. Perhaps a lot of repetition, but bear with me. So the title is Past, Present and Absent, Memory and Chronotype in Hilary Mantel's Giving Up the Ghost. The time and space are inextricably linked in a narrative's language is known and understood by scholars and critics. However, Mantel's memoir makes this link and its workings explicit as we read on about her life and her trauma. Furthermore, what is also starkly visible is how the time-space relationship changes as she moves on from one phase of her life to another. Written in 5 parts with an afterword of sorts, Mantel's memoir is interspersed by her account of crucial events from her life, some of which she recalls more vividly than the other. She writes, "The story of my childhood is a complicated sentence that I'm always trying to finish and put behind. It resists finishing, and partly this is because words are not enough. My early world was synesthetic, and I'm haunted by the ghosts of my own sense impressions, which re-emerge when I try to write it and shiver between the lines." The first part of the memoir gives an insight into a process of writing it. She makes her readers aware of how she has written it, of her various strengths and shortcomings. She talks of how we recollect events from our past life and how our sense can sometimes deceive our memory. Her own process of recollection, although not unique, is what fascinates me. That she spends a considerable amount of time, effort, and space in conveying to her readers how she interprets and conceives her past is very significant. The 4 parts that follow are an attempt at chronicling her life, or more accurately, the crucial events of her life as best as she could. She spends a significant amount of second and third part trying to put into words her childhood, interspersed with details from when she was 4, then 6, 7, 8, and then 10. When she turns 11, she says her childhood ended. So she writes in the very first part, "I have an investment in accuracy. I would never say it doesn't matter, it's history now. I know, on the other hand, that a small child has a strange sense of time. When a year seems a decade and everyone over the age of 10 seems grown up and of an equal age. So although I feel sure of what happened, I'm less sure of the sequence and the date line. I know too that once a family has acquired a habit of secrecy, memories begin to distort because its members confabulate to cover the gaps in the facts. You have to make some sort of sense of what's going on around you. So you cobble together a narrative as best as you can. You add to it and reason about it, and the distortions breed distortions." So Mantel is very much aware that her sense of personal chronology of how the events in her life unfold, it's been disrupted. And she also mentions the several possible reasons as to why this could be disrupted. I mean, there's so much going on. And so she goes on, she says, doctors used to say babies didn't feel pain. We know they were wrong. We are born with our sensibilities. Perhaps we are conceived that way. Part of our difficulty in trusting ourselves is that in talking of memory, we are inclined to use geological metaphors. We talk about buried parts of our past and assume the most distant in time are the hardest to reach. One has to prospect for them with the help of a hypnotist or a psychotherapist. I don't think memory is like that. Rather, that it is like St. Augustine's spreading limitless room, or a great plain, a step where all the memories are laid side by side at the same depth, like seeds under the soil. So this disruption, this distortion, it doesn't concern her. She doesn't make claims for authenticity of when happens, what is happening at what time. She embraces it like Kurt Vonnegut, had said in Slaughterhouse-Five, being unstuck in time. Like Vonnegut's protagonist, Mantel too decides to write in her own so it goes style. She says in the very first chapter that I will just go for it. I'll hold out my hands and say, c'est moi. Get used to it. So further on, the allusion she makes to St. Augustine is also very significant to my central question of how she recalls and recreates personal history. The spreading limitless room suggests that moments in time are juxtaposed. While trying to make chronological and coherent sense of that which is personally incomprehensible or unnarratable to the author, the constant juxtaposing of the past and present suggests that the past and present are always present, laid side by side in the limitless room of time. Her understanding of time in retrospect is through space, a space spread out with memories that she tries as best she could to put in the correct order for her readers. Like St. Augustine, she believes that meaning is distilled retrospectively through the integrative functioning of memory. It is only in recollection that the person can actually understand what he has experienced and see true meaning in it. To cite a particular instance, her reliance on the spatial aspect of memory is made visible in how she evokes her place of belonging in terms of geographical markers and not in terms of personal association. It's always 56 Bank Bottom or 20 Broscroft. These are houses, not homes. To her, the only place I think she truly feels like she belongs is the one place that does not belong to her. It's her grandparents' place. As a child, she goes there a lot. So her memories, therefore, are arranged in association with these spaces. And this relationship stands out in her memoir, which brings me to Mikhail Bakhtin's concept or idea of the chronotope. Bakhtin's concept of the chronotope literally translates as time-space, chrono and tope. So put forth the theory as referring to the unity of time and space inherent to a narrative. The chronotope thus provides what Bakhtin calls a substantial basis for the showing and depiction of events, thanks to its particular solidification and concretization of the distinguishing marks of time in definite areas of space. This brings us back to the idea of geographical markers in terms of both space and time. She keeps repeating at 56 Bank's Bottom, at 58 Bank Bottom, or at 20 Broscroft. Each passing mention of these spaces is marked in its significance by the preposition that comes before it. And it's usually at, which is used a lot more frequently than in or on or to, which marks the spatial temporal significance of that event. Further, this framework allows us to state that time can thicken and become artistically visible. Yes. And space can become charged and responsive to the moments of time. This is somewhat explored by Mantel herself through an analogy which she makes in the later part of her memoir, where she states that writing about your past is like blundering through your house with the lights fused, hands flailing for points of reference. You locate the stolen wardrobe and its door swings open at your touch, opening on the sounds of darkness within. Your hand touches the glass. You think it is the mirror, but it is the window. There are obstacles to bump and trip you, but what is more disconcerting is a sudden empty space where you can't find a handhold, and you know that you are stranded in the dark. So this analogy about the past being a dark space where one is stranded, trying to find something to hold on to, often not able to distinguish one event or object from another, comes after she mentions that she had a pain in her legs, concerning which she went to a doctor. That was my big mistake, she says. The one where she sees herself enter a dark, unknown terrain. And again, another significant line which follows, each day I was taking, though I didn't know, a small step towards the unlit terrain of sickness, a featureless landscape of humiliation and loss. At Roebuck Road, note the at Roebuck Road again, the stairhead was dark and some previous occupant had pinned on the blank wall you saw as you descended a poster with an owl. It was a child's owl, a simple and almost a cartoon owl, not less baleful for that. I wanted to rip it down, but I couldn't reach it. The featureless landscape of humiliation and loss that she talks of, symbolized by the staircase and her detest towards the poster of the owl she couldn't reach, are marked again in her memory and her narrative by the chronotope of Roebuck Road. And she also repeats this metaphor, the symbolism of the owl. It happens recurringly in her work. In the initial mention of each traumatic event, Mantel brings to insert the inner workings of her memory, her process of recollection, the event itself, and consequently inability of words to capture its impact on her person and life. This is heightened in the fluidity of her language, which does not follow a concrete pattern of was/is or were/are. Like I said, the past and present are intermingling constantly. The binary opposition of past and present is dissolved, like many other binary oppositions, which mentioning a lot of instances and events in the past tense over the second half of her memoir. A lot of the first half, where she talks about her childhood, is written as a live experience, in particular, her wish to be a boy, which is really fascinating. You know, she says, and these four instances are actually spread, you can notice the page numbers. So I'm waiting to change into a boy when I'm 4, this will occur. Few paragraphs later, she says, I'm 4 already. Then 3, 4, I'm still 4. I think I will be it forever. For a while, at 6, I cling to the prospect of a man's life. So I think when she hits the age of 7, she realizes that she's not going to be a boy. And her wish to be a boy is expressed clearly and repeatedly. These are just 4 instances that I've put up here, and is even played out in forms of games, where a young Hilary can be seen role-playing as a boy, a man, a knight-errant, or a priest. However, the reasons are reserved, absent from the narrative, left to the reader to speculate, which brings me to an essential and remarkable part of her life and her narrative, to borrow from her own words, where she says that the true nature of things was always hidden. No one would say plainly what was what, not if they could help it. And that's precisely what she is also doing in her memoir. While putting down in vivid detail her recollections of what it was like as a child, Mantel doesn't pause to speculate or reasons for or with her readers. She doesn't spoon feed her readers, yet asks herself, and this is initially when she starts writing the memoir, is my writing clear or is it deceptively clear? The past and present juxtapose in her narrative, but the absences are also very striking. The absence of detail, of time, of narrative are all indicative of a past that doesn't resurface in her recollections or is held back on purpose so that everything may not be seen. Quoting Orwell in the first part of the memoir, she says, good prose is like a window pane. but redacts from that style of writing as she strays away from the beaten path of plain words into a meadow of extravagant similes. Later in the fourth part of her memoir, she says, once you have learned the habits of secrecy, they aren't so easy to give up. This is why this chapter is shorter than it might be. And this is the fourth chapter, the part that she's talking about. In a longer part of this essay, I would have expanded on this idea of absence. But moving on, this amalgamation of past, present, and absent, of what was, what is, and what is not, echoes the Derridian idea of trace in both written and spoken discourse. To quote Derrida himself, and I quote, the play of differences involves synthesis and referrals, which prevent there from being at any moment or in any way a simple element which is present in itself, in and of itself, and refers only to itself. Unquote. And this is also what both Kevin and Eleanor had just mentioned, as a part of the Q&A we were talking. So this slippage, which Derrida speaks of in context of language, whether written or spoken, since he opposes that hierarchy and binary, lends itself to understanding better the way Mantel narrates her own story. Placing events in limitless rooms of time and space, the chronological order is always interrupted with her present reflection of it, or some other event from another time and space. Nothing is ever simply present or absent. Even her physical self is understood in terms of something that is always in transition. And here are several instances where she talks about her own self, her own physical body. And it's very striking that she'll mention it the way she does, always in terms of how much space she's occupying, and always falling back on comparison, comparing herself to something. She's always secondary to something. So specifically, when she talks about reading Lewis Carroll, she says, to console me for being an invalid, I get Alice to read. I read both her adventures, but I prefer the looking glass. It is easy to imagine myself passing through a mirror, every cell of my body thinning, stretching, becoming transparent, forming and reforming in some other dimension. So finding company in books. She also does this comparison with Noel Coward's characters, Candia McWilliams, and Carell we've already we seen. So she's never really her own true self till, as she puts it, she begins to write her memoir in an attempt to seize the copyright in myself, she says. Always in transition and invalid, as she brings up various times throughout her writing. She states rather simply how she had been so mauled by medical practices, so sabotaged and made over, so thin and so fat that sometimes she felt that each morning it is necessary to write herself into being. The process of writing oneself into being, as she puts it, needs to be explored, especially in terms of writing and language. Throughout her memoir, broken but put together sentences are interspersed with descriptions of colors, sizes, shapes, and textures. She uses symbolism, similes, analogies, so profound, and specifically and very importantly, intertextuality. It's markedly important in her text, and it affords her a fluidity in language which is uniquely suited to the task of narrating events from her childhood, her awkward growth phase, her struggle for making ends meet, and her misdiagnosis and illness. The Orwellian clarity, which she perhaps finds too much like legal language. David did a paper yesterday talking about it, and she says in her memoir that she believes that legal languages cognate with magic. So it doesn't allow her to trace her history, personal history. It doesn't allow her to put into words, as Raymond Williams would say, the structures of feeling. And just to sort of deviate to what structures of feeling means and why I'm implementing this here, it is what he considered to be more formally, fixed categories of such as ideology or worldview. It's what he distinguishes from that. He observes we reduce social formations and elements of culture and society to fixed forms. So but then he's saying that social consciousness is lived actively in real relationships. It exists in the present. It is the articulation of presence that most distinguishes the term structures of feelings. And I think this is what Mantel sort of brings in. She implements this in language. And this also reminded me of how Virginia Woolf writes. And it's also interesting because Mantel talks about Woolf in one of her personal essays, which she titles Diary. And she says, I read, this is where she talks about Woolf. I read On Being Ill by Virginia Woolf. What schoolgirl piffle, I think. It's like one of those compositions by young ladies mocked in Tom Sawyer. I can't understand what she means when she complains about the poverty of the language. We have to describe illness. For the sufferer, she says there is nothing ready-made. Then what of the whole vocabulary of singing aches, of spasms, of strictures and cramps, the gouging pain, the drilling pain, the pricking and pinching, the throbbing, burning, stinging, smarting, flaying, all good words, all old words. No one's pain is so special that the Devil's Dictionary of Anguish has not anticipated it. Pain may pass beyond language, but it doesn't start beyond it. The torture chamber is where people speak. I think this is very significant, her sort of criticism of Woolf. At the same time, her own idea of how to put pain into language, how to recollect everything and then put it across. So I think she goes beyond Woolf and she brings in that idea that is captured in William's idea of structure of feeling. Also, Woolf concurs with Freud and the modernist tradition of trauma theory, but Mantel counters with evidence of the linguistic ingenuity of pain, like, she explains here. Also, as opposed to Woolf's stream of consciousness, the lived social consciousness of Mantel's own life experience is articulated as stream of presences, I would suggest, and some of which she calls ghosts, which she is, trying to give up. As far as feelings are concerned, Mantel reminding us of her aversion to feminine qualities, rather sardonically puts it, and she says, and I quote, Virginia never oozes. Her secretions are ladylike, tears, not bile, unquote. Further, Leigh Gilmore, I think my time is okay. Leigh Gilmore also makes a case for post-humanism, and she states that Mantel takes up the critique of humanism when she disturbs the notion that the outside observable body reliably presents an inner being. And in the case of a racialized, gendered, or disabled body, provides evidence of an inferior or marked being capable of only limited agency. So I think the idea of writing about pain also is made easy in a way when she's allowed to play with language like she does, play with tenses specifically. And while a lot has been said about the thematic concerns of Mantel's autobiographical works, their structural implications and intertextual nature is hardly examined. So in one of her interviews, she confesses that her memoir was meant as a private exercise, not to be published and read by anyone other than her. And it is not known as to why she changed her mind. Perhaps it was an attempt at seizing her own copyright. We can only speculate, but I'm glad she did. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Akshada, for that excellent paper. I didn't want to cut you short, particularly as we have a little bit more time, as we only have 2 papers in this panel. So thank you very much for that. And as with all the other panels, we'll take questions at the end. So if I could just bring in our second panelist, Neil Vickers. And a reminder that Neil is talking to us about Hilary Mantel and psychiatry. So whenever you're ready, Neil.
Thanks so much, Eileen. And thanks to Eileen and Lucy for conceiving of this special event. It's an amazing thing to be at. I'm very, very grateful to Steve and to Ben and all the team at the Huntington, and it's a real honor to be here and to hear these papers. And I also feel like such a minnow here, talking to such experts. I'm going to talk briefly just about a kind of origin theory of what is my favorite Mantel novel, which is Giving Up the Ghost, not Giving Up the Ghost, sorry, Freudian slip, Beyond Black. So in her memoir, Giving Up the Ghost, Hilary Mantel describes how her adolescence ended with a spell as a psychiatric inpatient. It was the early 1970s, and her troubles began when she reported a pain which I could not explain. It seemed to wander about my body, nibbling here, stabbing there, flitting every time I tried to put my finger on it. Many years later, she established that these pains were probably caused by endometriosis, a notoriously difficult condition to diagnose. But as her doctors could find no physical cause for them at the time, they concluded that they were psychosomatic. Her GP put her on tricyclic antidepressants. Her pains continued. She was then sent to see a psychiatrist, Dr. G. Dr. G told her ailments stemmed from the fact that she was a law student. The law, he told her, was too intellectually demanding a subject for a woman, especially one as conscientious as Mantel. He advised her to give up studying the law and to get a job in a dress shop like her mother. Dr. G described Valium, but instead of tranquilizing her, Mantel found that the drug made her furious. She wanted to burn down buildings. Dr. G thought she was sliding rapidly into psychosis, and he put her on antipsychotics, to which she had an akathesic psychotic adverse reaction, which resulted in her being admitted as a psychiatric patient. It took several weeks for her doctors to see that her psychosis was iatrogenic. She resolved to endure her pains and to steer clear of psychiatrists forever. Psychiatrists and psychiatry barely feature in Mantel's fiction, but she regularly reviews books on psychiatry, on psychiatric social work, and the provision of mental health services. Her experiences in the early 1970s seem to have made her skeptical about the power of psychiatry to help people recover from mental illness. She writes movingly about the experiences of those in psychological distress and about the difficulties they have in getting others to understand them. And she's especially alert to the edge of madness in everyday experience and the power of personal relationships to contain it. The rage Valium stimulated in her, for instance, was disproportionate and dangerous and very distressing for her. But it was made 10 times worse by being put under the microscope as if it was something that only an expert could understand. She was to bear responsibility for it alone, even though rage is a common enough experience. If there is a single unifying thread in Mantel's writings on mental health, it is the importance of empathy. It isn't simply that the treatment without empathy is a contradiction in terms for her, though it is. It is that empathy is the most powerful element in any attempt to relieve mental distress. This made her very suspicious of expertise, for expertise must always be based on something more than empathy, I think. In some of her writings, Mantel appears to regard the diagnostic categories of psychiatry as defenses against empathy. In May 2010, for instance, she published a review in The Guardian of a book by the poet Joanne Limburg about living with OCD. Following a description of the typical OCD sufferer, Mantel observes, half the women I know have the traits she ascribes in this passage to a pathology. So perhaps the trouble was womanhood, unquote. In this talk, I want to explore the contours of Mantel's stance on psychiatry further, building on Mokshada's talk on Giving Up the Ghost, by considering Beyond Black. As many people here will know, the two books are connected. She began working on Beyond Black, but got stuck with it and decided that the best way to break the logjam was to develop a memoir she'd been writing on and off since at least 1998. I want to suggest that an important background to both these works lies in a book review that she published in the New York Review of Books in 1999. The review was of Gita Sereni's Cries Unheard, Why Children Kill, the Story of Mary Bell. I'm sorry, I'm having difficulty getting my, can I move? Yeah. You can see it now, I hope.
Yeah, we can see it now, Neil, thanks.
So in December 1968, Mary Bell, then aged 11, was tried alongside the 13-year-old Norma Bell, no relation, for the manslaughter of two young boys, Brian Howe and Martin Brown, 3 and 4 years old, respectively. The charge was manslaughter because Mary and Norma were too young to face a murder charge, but they were tried nevertheless as adults in an adult court. Norma was acquitted. She was found to have a mental age of 8, but Mary was found guilty of manslaughter with diminished responsibility. The judge wanted to send Mary to a psychiatric hospital for treatment, but no suitable place could be found. She was sent to a secure unit within a boys' reformatory, Red Bank in Lancashire, where she spent 4 years, as the only girl, by the way, among 20 boys, before being transferred on her 16th birthday into a women's prison for a further 7 years. And no sooner was she there than she asked for a gender reassignment. So Gita Sereni, famous journalist, biographer of Albert Speer, among others, covered Mary's trial for the Sunday Telegraph and published a book about it, The Case of Mary Bell, which appeared in 1972. Cries Unheard was her second book about Mary Bell, and it was based on 5 months' worth of tape-recorded interviews that she conducted with Mary in the late 1990s when Mary was in her early 40s. Its purpose was to get a first-hand account of Mary's childhood, both before and after her period in custody. How had her time at Red Bank gone? What had prison done to her? But Sereni was also concerned with the second question: how can goodness be destroyed and then rebuilt within a single personality? You may remember, I mean, as some people here will remember, they actually passed a law about this book because Gita Sereni paid Mary Bell £10,000. The Mail went berserk and they discovered her identity. She's long since changed her name from Mary Bell. She had to move out of her home. She had to tell her daughter who she is, or was. And the £10,000 served as an excuse for the Blair government to pass a law where you couldn't profit from your crimes. So the law that you can't profit from your crimes was about the £10,000 that Mary Bell received from Gita Sereni. So Sereni discovered that Mary's home life had been appalling. Mary's mother was a prostitute who specialized in violent sex. Mary grew up not knowing who her father was. And whenever she asked, she was told she was the devil's spawn. Mantel remarks, no candidate for fatherhood is produced by Sereni's book, and the reader will draw her own conclusion as to how close to home he might be found. It is safe to say, at any rate, that he lived somewhere closer than the infernal regions. Mary was admitted to hospital, aged 1, with a drug overdose. When she was 4 or 5 years of age, her mother began to use her in her work. Mary was subjected to extreme sexual abuse. She told Sereni that she underwent oral rape, sodomy, and was regularly hooded and gagged. On at least one occasion, she passed out. Sereni implies that Mary had been picked up and suffocated in a manner similar to the way that she picked up and suffocated the little boys she killed. The murders Mary committed were thus, in Sereni's view, instances of acting out. Sereni wanted the courts to take account of the psychic meanings of crimes for the perpetrators, their meanings in fantasy, including unconscious fantasy. Crimes are not simply wrongs committed by one person against the other, in Sereni's view. They may also be meaningful records of other wrongs in which the perpetrator was the victim. The difficulty was how to show the courts how to treat crimes as legal palimpsests. This part of Sereni's argument seems to have irked Mantel, the former law student, the most. Here we go. Sereni seems to confuse Mary's state at the time of the killing, which certainly was addressed by the court, with Mary's motive, which she thinks the court ought to have established, despite the fact that after almost 30 years of work on the case, her own insights into Mary's motive are shadowy and partial. The whole problem, she says, of trying children in adult courts is that the entire judicial process is based solely on evidence. The only thing that should count is human evidence, the answer to the question, why? By human evidence, she means the opinion of experts trained in therapeutic disciplines of which she approves. Quote. Sorry, I'll go on to another quote. She shows little appreciation of the intrusive nature of psychiatric treatment, or of the fact that it is subject to fads and fashions like other disciplines. It may be argued that psychiatric investigation cannot serve up truth. It can only make an untestable version, a plausible story that fits together. It allows us to make metaphor and myth, and that, if we are exact about the nature of the enterprise, is what Gita Sereni has done in the case of Mary Bell. A second set of objections was connected with Sereni's second question. How can goodness be destroyed and then rebuilt within a single personality? Mantel accepted Sereni's claim that Mary had done remarkably well in turning her life around since her conviction in 1968. But she insisted it had nothing to do with psychiatry. In Mary Bell's case, she writes, it was not treatment by experts, but the simple passage of time that made her learn to control her impulses and live within society. Dr. Michael Powell, a child and adolescent psychiatrist based in Manhattan, wrote to the New York Review of Books to protest that the director of Red Bank, a former naval officer called James Dixon, had achieved a stunning therapeutic success in rehabilitating Mary. But Mantel would have none of this. Gosh, I thought I had a slide of this. I don't. From Mary's comments, as presented by Gita Sereni, I deduce that James Dixon helped Mary because he was a wise adult who gave her security and understanding. The issue of his expertise is, in my view, beside the point. It is Gita Sereni who insists that Mary lost out by not undergoing psychiatric treatment. There is nothing naive in my belief that the passage of time helped Mary learn to control her impulses. This process is called growing up. It is not a random process, but generally predictable in its effects, and it requires no intervention by experts of any kind. She raises many, many other objections, but it is Mantel the lawyer in action, so I'm harking very much back to David's talk of yesterday. She says, for instance, well, Sereni wants children to be brought into court, for there to be no jury, for psychoanalytically trained psychiatrists or psychotherapists to ascertain the meaning of the crime, and only after this meaning has been established should it go to trial. And she talks about various ways in which this happens in continental Europe, and of course, in some states in the United States. To come to the point, Beyond Black, I think, is a portrait of the artist as Mary Bell. In her review of Cries Unheard, Mantel noted Mary's words describing her state of mind immediately before the killings. She was, she said, beyond rage, beyond pain. I don't know if those words prompted Mantel to use the title Beyond Black, but other aspects of the novel seem closely connected with Mary Bell's life story. The heroine of Beyond Black is Alison Hart, a spirit medium in her early 40s. Alison grows up in Aldershot with a prostitute mother who provides violent sex for a cabal of criminals. Alison spends most of her daily life conversing with the ghosts of these men. And I was so interested earlier on in Lucy's splendid interview with Ben Miles when she told him, we don't need to speak for these characters, we need to listen to the talking they're already doing. So Alison in Beyond Black has a spirit guide, Morris, who gives her access to the universe of the dead and who accompanies her everywhere. Alison's mother, like Mary Bell's, uses her daughter in her work. As Morris reminds her, they taught you what a blade could do. But Alison's own violence during childhood is directed solely against these men. It is hinted that when one of them, MacArthur, took her out to a shed, she gouged out his eye with a sharp instrument. Like Mary, Alison wants to know who her father is or was, but her mother refuses to tell her, and for a long time the reader is encouraged to suspect that it's MacArthur. Sereni's contention that criminal acts are records of past crimes is countered in Beyond Black by Alison's moral goodness. Alison has difficulty remembering her appalling childhood, and the ways in which she continues to be affected by it have no impact on her moral character. She is a good and generous person throughout. The most sinister power that the ghosts possess is to push her back into her traumatic past so as to rob her of the equanimity she has achieved as an adult. Mantel concedes that past traumas can be detrimental to personal development. They go on reverberating in the mind through the voices of those who inflict them. The perpetrators are irredeemable, as Alison remarks in a much quoted passage of the novel. Here I'm quoting, people are right to be afraid of ghosts. If you get people who are bad in life, I mean cruel people, dangerous people, why do you think they're going to be any better after they're dead? But she would never speak it, never utter the word death if she could avoid it. And even though they needed frightening, they deserved frightening, she would never, when she was with her clients, slip a hint or tip a wink about the true nature of the place beyond black. At the beginning of the novel, Alison thinks that if she can make friends with someone who has no connections with the supernatural and somehow pension Morris off in favor of a more benign spirit guide, her life will be much better. The normal friend appears in the shape of the mean-spirited Colette, who has recently separated from her boyfriend, Gavin. Soon after she moves in with Alison, Colette offers to write a book explaining how Alison communicates with ghosts. But Alison can't tell her how she does this. She can tell Colette the story of her life. She can even make the ghosts audible to Colette on tape recorders and telephone answering machines, but she can't show her what it is to be attuned to their messages. So Colette gives up. Alison's life is unwritable, except as fiction. In the end, Colette moves back in with the unsatisfactory Gavin, and Alison returns to her clairvoyant friends. Colette has nothing in common personally with Gita Sereni, but I wonder if this part of Beyond Black is an amplification of Mantel's remark in her review that Sereni had created an untestable version of Mary's life. A plausible story that fits together, as Mantel put it in the New York Review. Colette understands, as Gita Sereni did not, that a narrative does not put you in possession of facts. It gives you fiction. Colette's only mistake is to imagine that fiction is no good. There are other parallels linking Alison and Colette with Gita Sereni and Mary Bell. Colette's tape-recorded interviews with Alison are printed verbatim in a different typeface in exactly the same way that Sereni's interviews with Mary Bell appear in Cries Unheard. And Alison is interviewed by Colette at roughly the same age as Mary was when she collaborated on Cries Unheard. The moral of Beyond Black seems to be that the only way we can leave our ghosts behind is to become stronger in relation to them. This seems to involve immersing ourselves in the voices inside us. It is perhaps unsurprising then that since publishing Beyond Black, Mantel has become much more publicly involved in patient groups, not only for endometriosis, but also for psychological distress, service users, much more willing to engage with psychiatry, broadly conceived. She's given video interviews about her life to the psychotherapist Jane Haynes, who is the dedicatee of Beyond Black. And I even wonder if she was herself a patient of Jane Haynes. I found on the website of a psychotherapist based in Bath something that surprised me. A statement attributed to Mantel. I cannot find it anywhere, but perhaps someone here knows where it comes from. The therapeutic space offers an arena for the work, and the therapeutic method offers a line to guide us, like the ropes strung to mark out the path in dark caves, attributed to Hilary Mantel. The website is called Bath Psychotherapy. To my possibly cloth ear, it doesn't sound like Mantel at all. More recently, I mean, she's written a lot of puffs for Richard Bentley's book, Doctoring the Mind, Why Psychiatric Treatments Fail. Benthall, like Mantel, is a psychiatric skeptic, but he is pro-psychotherapy in a way that Mantel certainly wasn't when she wrote a review of Gita Sereni's book. And Mantel has also become much more interested in the detailed case histories of psychiatric patients and the treatment they received. I don't know if she still thinks that people get better simply by growing up, but somehow I doubt it. Exploring her own ghosts seems to have made her much more hopeful about the value of telling one's own life in one's own way. That doesn't mean she's become less of a psychiatric skeptic, but it does mean she's more open to the goals of psychotherapy. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much for that, Neil. If you have a cloth ear, then so do I, because I don't think that quote sounds at all like Mantel. It'd be interesting to know what other people think of that. So we now have time for some questions. So I'm just having a quick look at the chat boxes and I can't see anything in there at the moment. So before I obviously have questions for both of you, but before I jump in and ask those, I wonder if you have any questions for each other or if you want to make any comments about the resonances or connections between the papers that you've just so expertly delivered.
I loved Mokshada's paper, and I think the chronotope is a wonderful way of pursuing it. I mean, because when I've read Beyond, sorry, I conflate them, as you can hear, Giving Up the Ghost and Beyond Black. And I think that it's always seemed to me that each chapter has a different setting. It's got a different house. And then you get in the last chapter, you get all those sorts of places on the M4 corridor, which is also the setting for the psychic fairs in Beyond
Yes.
Black.
Yeah, I completely agree with what you were saying about Giving Up the Ghost. Beyond Black is one of the works that I have not read, and I think you've convinced me to do that very soon. So I'll be picking that up. And I pursued Mantel as a hobby, total hobby. So I loved all the insights that I got from your paper. I mean, especially how thorough you were with the psychiatric, bringing in all the scientific terms and, making it way more authentic than I ever could by just my reading of the autobiography. So thank you so much.
Very generous. Thank you.
Thank you both. There haven't been any further questions posted. So I was really interested in your very close reading, Mukshada, of Giving Up the Ghost, which is fascinating, a fascinating text. And there were lots of things in there that were fresh to me, which is lovely. I loved all of the commentary about being unstuck in time and the connection with Woolf, who she is both, you know, horribly dismissive of, and yet kind of builds on her ideas, as you so clearly pointed out. I wondered if you could tell us a little bit more about the relationship between secrecy and absence that you did touch upon. And you said that you would explore more in a longer paper. So I wondered if you'd like to tell us a little bit more about that now.
Yes, definitely, because I think Eleanor also pointed out that the way she writes Mantel, it's very Derridian. And especially when you're talking about fiction, you can take liberties with language. You can bring in past, present, future. And considering that Mantel is writing about historical fiction, we already know what's going to happen. For a lot of characters, a lot of events, she can experiment with language. A lot of experimentation can be done. However, when we move to something as, something that we regard a level of authenticity, like a memoir, an autobiography, things become a lot more complicated. So her insistence that, she is repeatedly bringing the past and the present together is it was very fascinating. However, I could not help but notice how certain things were just hidden, not explicitly stated, and she repeatedly also evokes that fact that she's hiding. Like she's grown up in her family. She's talking about the fact that distortions, breed distortions, and that is precisely what she also admits to doing to an extent. And there are a lot of instances in the book where she holds back. She doesn't open up about something. She doesn't give us a reason as to why that is happening. She lets us speculate, or I'd say that in that in saying nothing, she says a lot.
Yeah, I agree.
Possibility, the ambiguity of how many different scenarios can be built out of something like that. I personally really like that, and I think that's also very Derridian of her. When he talks about trace, when he talks about writing, and even I think yesterday when Lucy was talking, she mentioned something about specters, and something of that is going on. And I wanted to expand on that, but well, I didn't have enough time. So
yeah, of course. I mean, one of the things that I had noticed for the first time when I was listening to your paper is where she says the chapter would have been shorter or longer, and I loved that. I hadn't noticed that before, but yeah, what a tease that is. Yes. So as you say, yeah, she is always telling you she's always outlining that she's not telling you everything. So there are a couple of questions just to come back to the chat now. So Lucy has asked Neil a question which is in relation to this synergy between the role of the spirit medium and the role of the psychotherapist, which I have paraphrased rather ineptly there. So do come in, Lucy, if you'd like to phrase that better. So that's a question to Neil. And if I might also have a look at Kevin's question, which is a question, sorry, I'm having real problems with my chat box. A question in relation to resonance as well, but in relation to structures of feeling and narratizing of trauma. So I'm thinking that that's a question that's for both panelists. But again, do jump in, Kevin, if I haven't expressed that very well. So maybe if we could take Lucy's question first about the medium and the psychiatrist, and if you could answer that, Neil.
Yeah, I think there's clearly something like that going on, isn't there? And I think also, though, I think she really wants a kind of subaltern form of expertise, something that will be degraded. And I think the naffness of psychic fairs, F-A-Y-R-E, I just love the spelling.
Yeah.
Is an essential part of Alison's mission. And of course, she's much more of, I mean, she's closer to the fortune teller in this regard, in that she perceives things that she must keep from the client at all costs. Now, you could say, of course, you know, that's Bionian containment or Winnicottian holding. You do that, and we do it for friends, we do it for kids, we do it all the time. And so, yeah, I mean, there just is that borderland. I wanted to come, if I could, I'm not changing the subject, but Moksha at one point talked about racialized difference in giving up the ghost. And as an Irish person, I'm acutely conscious of Mantel's Irishness. And I do remember a review of Giving Up the Ghost that appeared in the New York Review by John Banville. To my mind, the best contemporary Irish novelist, in which he says, and I've never seen anyone else say this, that Mantel's Irish family are travellers. And that's what explains the uncles appearing and then taking to the road. And of course, she makes a point of not saying where in Ireland she's from. And again, you know, I think she's terribly drawn. I think the spirit medium stuff is part and parcel of that to me, very Irish baggage. And that's the kind really of defiant affirmation of ghosts.
Yeah, I mean, it's making me think of the Giant O'Brien again, and some of the aspects, some of the I'm struggling to find the right kind of words for this, Neil, but there's something about that novel that when you're reading from the giant's point of view in particular, that is deliberately fluid and is deliberately elliptical. I mean, that'd be my word for it, but I think that you're right, that it's drawing on a particular heritage. I'm just conscious that there are now some questions in the chat box, which I have managed to tame onto one side of my screen. So we've picked up on Lucy's. Kevin was talking about structures of feeling and the narratizing of trauma. Can we think of resonance and solidity in tension with one another, which is a great question in terms of Mantel's writing, or does one necessarily lead to the other? Obviously, I'm interested in this in terms of the page and the stage. So I wonder if we could pause upon that for a moment. So this idea of resonance and solidity in tension with one another. What are your thoughts about that?
Shada, do you want to go in there?
I think in terms of when you're talking about tension, there's a lot of that going on when she talks about writing. Like I had brought it up in my paper. And there's one instance in the novel where she says, it's an autobiography, I won't call it a novel, where she says that why does the act of writing create this anxiety in me? This anticipation of creating something that is going to be seen, creating a personal history, you know, she's going to put herself out there, a version of herself perhaps. So that tension runs throughout the text. I could feel it because every time she would talk about something traumatic, she would go back to the fact that this is how I'm going to talk about it, you know, this is how I'm going to write about it. This is what I'm thinking I should be doing about it. So that tension, I think, is, I'm not sure if I'm answering your question correctly, Kevin, but that is something that I find overwhelmingly present in the text.
I I think that's a great answer. It's just making me think about Mantel as a critic as well. I mean, she's happy to be critical, and we've seen a great deal of her criticism in the papers. We've seen her reviews, we've seen her book reviews. Sorry, the sound is quite bad at my end, so I'm sorry if that's affecting other people. But she also wants to write, doesn't she? And I've not really thought about that before, that she's happy to shoot down Wolfe in her attempts to put the figurative eye on the page, but then she knows that she might be a victim of criticism herself. I mean, she talks about that kind of writing as so much evidence against you, doesn't she? That's one of the ways that she refers to it. Sorry, so there are lots of things that I could say, but I don't want to miss out on anything that has been posted. So Lucy has talked about Alison and the difference between me and the other psychics being that she can do it, which I think is quite interesting. And there's a few responses there from Kevin. Sorry,
I said good splitting is everything.
Yes.
It's what we all need to be able to do.
Yeah.
Whereas, what I think is dramatized, or what I think she's coming up against in Mary Bell is somebody, she complains that Mary Bell gives 4 or 5 versions of her story.
Yeah.
Splitting processes aren't working,
Yeah, that's interesting. So healthy splitting versus unhealthy splitting, or healthy doubling versus unhealthy doubling. I mean, I think, to be honest with you, Neil, you're the first person who's ever explained Beyond Black to me in a way that I really, really understand. I am blown away by the argument of your paper, and I'm sure I'm not the only one. There was one thing that I wanted to ask you, though, which was in relation to Mantel's citing of Oliver Sacks in particular as an influence. Yeah. So I thought that was quite interesting. I love the distinction you make between Benton and his very pro psychology and psychological approaches, but not psychiatry. And I can see absolutely where Mantel is placing herself in terms of that, and that is a shift, but it is not a shift towards psychiatry. But what are your thoughts about that she quite openly has cited Sacks as an influence in terms of her writing and her thinking?
Yes, well, a man who spent 40 years in analysis.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose, it always seems to me, my main thing, I should say, is illness. And I think that the best illness narratives are the ones where the writer succeeds in being an N of 1. And boy, does she succeed in being an N of 1. And of course, this is what's said about Sacks's patients. Indeed, Sacks used to run into terrible problems at medical meetings where they'd say, Dr. Sacks, we've never come across a case like this. And he says, oh, well, that's because you don't get them to come and live with you. So, I mean, he was, yeah.
I'm seeing some of the connections here. I think some of the elements of the Maverick.
Yes.
Okay, I'm just having a look at whether there are any other questions. I don't think that there are questions exactly in the chat, so I'm wondering whether or not we might draw the panel to a close there. Would that be all right, Steve? If we
that seems sensible to me.
Okay.
I don't know how Lucy and yourself envisaged the closing section working, but it might be a good idea if everybody could put their cameras on so that we can all see each other and hear each other as you discuss next steps for Mantel's studies.
I'm just going to leap in here if that's okay, Eileen.
Of course, go for it.
So I'm not going to keep you all for very much longer. It's been a wonderful evening for me, morning for some of you, afternoon maybe for other people. I'm aware we've all been at our screens for a long time. So the first thing I want to do is offer some really heartfelt thanks. Firstly to Steve Hindle, whose enthusiasm for this programme and his flexible approach to the way Eileen and I really wanted to run this conference really has been completely invaluable. Steve and his colleagues at the Huntington enabled us to run the CFP, which is not really the normal way of things, but it felt really important for speaking to Hilary's papers and for getting as diverse a range of voices in Mantel scholarship on the programme as possible. And we're just extremely grateful to Steve for that. We'd also like to thank Steve's team, including Catherine Miller, who has had preternatural patience as I have navigated this international conference process. I honestly couldn't thank her enough. And Ben Tuttle, obviously, who has been the kind of eye in the sky throughout the proceedings for the past 2 days and has saved all of our bacon, I'm sure, without us even knowing it, such as his deftness. I also would like to extend my heartfelt thanks to my co-convener, Eileen Pollard. Collaborating with a colleague of Eileen's warmth and generosity and insight is always a pleasure, and this conference has been no exception. She's a visionary Mantel scholar, and my own work owes her a great deal. I'm sure many other people in our kind of virtual room today feel the same way. So thank you so much for making this such a pleasurable experience, Eileen. I'd also like to thank our panelists for being just so generous with their thoughts and their time. This has been such a lovely collegial set of discussions. I wish we could all be kind of wandering around the Huntington Gardens carrying on these conversations, but we will do that. There are kind of plans afoot for making those conversations carry on virtually. This week's event has been brought to us by researchers from across the world at all career stages, a multitude of disciplines. And I think that kind of multifaceted, really collegial set of conversations is really entirely down to you as panelists and contributors. So just thank you so much for your time and energy. Finally, I'd like to reiterate Steve's thanks to Hilary herself for her support of this event, for her continuing generosity towards scholars of her work. I know myself and Eileen have both benefited from that hugely. I know Hilary was hoping to be able to tune in for some of this event and unfortunately wasn't able to, but has very much expressed an interest in seeing the papers that were presented today, and I'll be following up on that with our panelists shortly after we close today. I gave the title of this kind of brief closing session, Where Now for Mantel Studies, and obviously that demands a multiplicity of answers, and I think we've started seeing them in the chat actually today and yesterday. So these very few kind of remarks are drawn together from my observations. If anybody else wants to pop things in the chat that they really feel have come out of these conversations and they really feel that these are aspects that the field needs to be focusing on, please do pop them in there so we can have a record of that. Having had the pleasure of listening to all of this week's papers, and it really has been an enormous pleasure, it strikes me that it is really imperative that we continue to build and expand this international network of scholars, which an overflow of meaning has brought together, to ensure that this is a critical field that is able to benefit from really diverse international perspectives. Hilary's work blossoms under kind of this diverse kind of scrutiny, and I think it's imperative that we continue to expand our network here. Likewise, I've been really struck by the diversity of disciplinary approaches on display. Our last panel has shown it, all of our panels have shown it. I've learned so much about the legal system and embroidery and psychiatry that I couldn't have possibly imagined learning before this event began. And I think that diversity really kind of indicates the immensely rich possibilities which exist when thinking Mantel's work with as varied and as curious a set of disciplinary approaches as the author takes to her own work. Finally, the timing of this conference, as the stage play of The Mirror and the Light continues to run in the West End, I think has prompted for me, and certainly a lot of the conversations today have prompted a real curiosity around thinking Mantel in adaptation. There are multiple opportunities there now, including a radio adaptation of Beyond Black, which I was almost a bit too scared to listen to. That was a couple of years ago now. It was a Radio 4 production, and it was a really remarkable kind of approach to that text. But yes, thinking about the significance of adaptations for Mantel studies and what those adaptations are doing in terms of shaping the media that they find themselves in. So the conversations that have started here at an Overflow of Meaning are a significant contribution to the next stage of Mantel studies, and one that I hope will include further sustained use of the rich and complex literary archives that are held here at the Huntington. So I would like to close my remarks with, predictably, a quotation from Bring Up the Bodies. It's a quotation much beloved of conclusion writers everywhere. And that is, there are no endings. If you think so, you are deceived as to their nature. They are all beginnings. Here is one. Thank you so much.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Lucy. So I have some thank yous of my own to offer in a moment. And again, I don't want to detain you very long. But just speaking from my own perspective as a historian of early modern England, it strikes me that although in discussing the Cromwell trilogy in particular, at several points we came close to discussing the relationship between history and historical fiction, most obviously in David's paper. I really wonder how much mileage there is in interrogating Hilary's emphasis on authenticity. There's that celebrated quote that she made in an email correspondence with Mary Robertson, who I know is still in the audience here, that she resists the temptation to invent, even though she knows it's her obligation as a novelist. And I've always been fascinated by that particular intervention because it seems to me to collapse the distinction between history and historical fiction in very, very interesting ways. I've also been struck on a slightly related theme. I was often originally inspired as a junior career scholar by Stephen Greenblatt's amazing phrase at the beginning of Shakespearean negotiations. I began with a desire to speak with the dead. And over my career as a historian, I've realized that I'm not speaking with the dead. I am in some sense speaking for them. But I was really struck by Ben Miles' formulation this morning that you don't speak for them, you just listen to the conversations that they are already having. And that, I think, is going to have a profound influence on my thinking as a historian of early modern England going forward. I don't know whether anybody else wants to comment on that before we draw to a close. Stunned into silence, I see. In which case, I shall let you all go. My mantra about the success of Huntington conferences is that it will always be obvious when the co-conveners have put the right people in the room. And it is abundantly clear to me that Lucy and Eileen have just done precisely that. They've had exactly the right people in the room. So thank you all for joining us. Eileen, did you want to say something?
I'd just jump in there just to say an absolutely huge thank you to Lucy, because, you know, really, Lucy has done the lion's share of all of the work and the thinking and the enthusiasm and the energy and the drive. And we really wouldn't be in this situation now if it hadn't have been for her. So I just wanted to end on that note that we have done it collaboratively, her and I, and we have worked very closely with the Huntington team, and it's been brilliant. But without her, it just wouldn't have happened. So I just want to end on that note. So thank you, Lucy.
Thank you.
So thank you, everybody out there in the audience. Thank you, Eileen. Thank you, Lucy. A personal, heartfelt thanks to Ben Tuttle. Your presence is so reassuring throughout all these proceedings. I wish everybody a lovely weekend.